And we're back. So now that you've taken an opportunity to digest that information that I gave you, let us proceed now into our period, starting, of course, a little bit before and moving right into our period. We will talk about colonialism overall as a whole between this period, 1880s, really until say around World War One. There's a different type of imperialism that really starts to unfold throughout the 1920s and 1930s, but we won't get to that really until our later units, especially leading right up to World War II. So let's just say that this era of late 19th century style imperialism ends at World War One or just after World War One, because the war itself starts to shake things up. But just put that in the back of your mind and just bury it there for a while, because right now we're going to talk about this period of imperialism and colonialism. Wonderful illustration here, believe it or not, of German troops, as you can see, marching into some far off Asian city. Germany eventually would start to amass a number of colonies throughout the Pacific and around Asia, along with all of her Western European and American brethren. And this would be part of a kind of a race to control the world and dominate it and create colonies to outspend and outgrow their rivals and subjugate the world under Western European rule. So that's where this video is going to go. So this is a copy of the slide that you saw from the previous lecture. We have a definition of colonialism and a definition of imperialism. For the most part, we'll use them interchangeably because they pretty much are the same. But there are some minor differences. Now, these definitions don't necessarily add up to the way I kind of learned about the differences, but mainly colonialism. The way I've always learned at colonialism is when the indigenous people who live in these areas where European or American powers, or Japanese for that matter, which we'll see a little bit later on, when they go into these places, people who are then subjugated become colonial peoples, people who are dominated by these outside powers. Imperialism might include the acquisition of land, but imperialism also suggests the ability to manipulate the economy and manipulate and take natural resources by somewhat indirect means as well. So you might have a military presence, you might have maybe even a military governor, and you might have colonists, colonial people, indigenous people who are there. But imperialism also suggests the role of private industry, maybe the church or missionaries trying to instigate certain reforms and subjugations that would allow these governments to have better access to these resources. Maybe it's the use of local powers and local elites that have made alliances with your government, and you create kind of puppet states to act on your behalf. So imperialism, there's a little bit more subterfuge, a little bit more indirect action, whereas colonialism is much more apparent when the colonizer arrives. I just wanted to point it out so those of you wouldn't be terribly confused. Although for our purposes, if you were to use them interchangeably, I would not penalize you or anything, because really they are going to be mostly interchangeable by this point. Something that I want to make mention of is that there is one very famous colonial entity that became a power in its own right, and that was the United States of America. Those of us who are very familiar, or at least mildly familiar with our own history, or at least like to celebrate it every Independence Day and possibly for Memorial Day too, we're very well aware of 1776 when the United Colonies of North America, minus Quebec and Canada, decided to secede from Great Britain and establish a new government known as the United States of America. That's a little bit of a different colony. Later on, of course, the British do become more oppressive. There are some reasons for that, and not necessarily bad ones, but this is not a early American history class, so let's not get into that. But it is true that the British begin to tax more goods, and perhaps even more importantly than the taxes themselves, tried to exert more control over local governments in order to get what they wanted, and the need to control industries on the continent of North America. For example, forcing colonial people in Massachusetts and Virginia to buy only British guns instead of French guns, or sending raw materials like tobacco and wool that was grown or cultivated in the colonies back to Great Britain for manufacturing, which is then turned into goods that are sold back to the colonists at a higher price, and the colonists are not allowed to buy from Spain or France. That's a closed market system. It's called mercantilism. It has capitalist qualities to it, but is not free market. So in that sense, yes, the people of North America, the colonists of what became the United States eventually, these 13 original colonies, were colonial people who were over time becoming more unsettled by the control of the British government, the home government, and how their rights, in their view, were being trampled. But there is a difference between them and, say, colonial India or colonial Ghana or colonial South Africa, and that's the people who came to populate the 13 original colonies were themselves Englishmen. They were British. They were of that heritage. And yeah, there were people who came over from Sweden and the Netherlands and that, but for the most part, they were British. George Washington was an Englishman. Thomas Jefferson was an Englishman. Benjamin Franklin was an Englishman. And so that kind of colony is not what we're referring to here. That would be called a saltwater colony. Now, what is a saltwater colony? A saltwater colony is a colony in which people from a motherland, the motherland in this case being Great Britain, are sent out to take over a certain place and, well, colonize it. That's what people typically think of when they think, ow, hit my foot. Ouch, ow, 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 that hurt. When people think of colonialism. But we're not going to be talking about saltwater colonies here. Yes, there will be British that go and live in India, and there'll be French that go and live in Vietnam, but it's not the same thing. The people who go and live there aren't going to live there because they want to make that part of France in the traditional sense. They are actually just going there to oversee their riches and then eventually go back home. So it's a very different concept. I just wanted to make that clear. So don't think of when you hear that term colonialism as we move forward here, and you think of that word usually in terms of the American colonial experience. This is going to be very different because there will be strong cultural, ethnic, and racial differences between colonizer and those who are colonized, something you really didn't have in the American Revolution. So by 1914, which is when World War I breaks out, between, say, the mid to late 1870s, all the way to 1914, this kind of, I don't really want to call it a golden age of imperialism or colonialism, but it kind of this heyday of colonialism, imperialism. A lot of places in the world outside of Europe are subjugated under European rule. And European rule also includes Russia and the United States for our purposes here. Colonies in South America, colonies in Africa, colonies in Asia, specifically India, the Middle East. And this is achieved through a number of means. And I'll talk about technology a little bit later in the next section. But the motivator here is different than the motivators that we talked about in the previous section on some of our colonial experiences in the earlier part, 1700s, 1600s, 1500s. There's still going to be that need for things like spices and commodities, like gold and silver. And there's still going to be this need to spread Christianity. That will always be present, this need to spread Christianity, because Christianity is part of civilization, and it's a way to save, quote, the heathen. But there will be more to it, because as these countries, as these European countries have industrialized and developed these highly robust capitalist industrial economies, as we said in our first unit on industrialism, what comes with industrialism? Well, there are two things. One, the need for raw materials, materials that do not exist within the mother country, and a market to sell said goods. And that's what we're going to have here. So you're going to have the need for sugar, say from the Caribbean. So sugar will be cultivated in the Caribbean, turned into sweets, turned into chocolate, and then sold back to people who live in those areas, as well as people who live in Europe. In the case with modern technological advancements, looking ahead, you'll have the development of the automobile in the United States. And like today, automobiles used tires with rubber. Where are they going to get rubber from? You have military vehicles like transport trucks that are going to use rubber. Where is this rubber going to come from? It's going to be cultivated in parts of Africa. It's going to be cultivated in parts of Asia, specifically in what is now present day Vietnam over here. And so rubber trees, which grow there, they're plentiful, will be cut down and then transported to mills and plants in Europe, France, and Great Britain, and they'll be transformed into rubber, the kind of rubber we use for gaskets, tires, and any other industrial use. So this very much is driving this expansion. So you have the need for basic commodities like spices and gold and silver and all that, the need to spread Christianity, and the need for real heavy duty raw materials ranging from rubber to sugar to iron to coal to oil, all of that stuff. And they will go out and get that to feed their industrial economy and to create new markets in which to sell, which will further grow their industrial economy. You also have this social Darwinist kind of view that did not fully exist in the previous era. It's true that Europeans were not necessarily the most enlightened people during the age of the sail, with people like Christopher Columbus, and that they saw the Indians as heathens, and they saw Africans as being not the same as them, although some Europeans were thoroughly impressed by how wealthy and powerful African kings were, especially the Congolese kings and the kings of Mali, who had gold and ivory and silver. And they had beautiful textiles. The African nations were very famous for their textiles. They really didn't want much from the Europeans. They wanted guns and some metal tools, but for the most part, they were satisfied. And some African countries, like the Kingdom of the Congo, definitely took an interest in Christianity and became Roman Catholic, although they mixed their Catholicism with a lot of their native religions as well. And you had kingdoms like Mali who were Muslim. So these nations, these African nations, were quite developed, more developed than what I think sometimes we even think of today. It's true they didn't have firearms and they didn't have sailing ships, but they didn't really need sailing ships. Africa is a gigantic continent. It's the largest continent outside of Eurasia. It is huge. This map does not really give it justice because it makes North America look like it's almost the same size, when in fact that is not the case. So Africa is more inward looking, whereas you see how small Europe is. They really have no choice but to take to the high seas and develop sailing technology. So it's really more of an external pressure than anything else. So where was I going with that? Oh, yes. So at this time, there was certainly prejudice. There was the belief that Christianity was the one true religion, and the other religions were not. There was the idea that some of these people that they encountered, whether they were Indian or African, were heathens or savages of some kind, even though a lot of them weren't. And in some cases, Europeans realized that and had to show deference to these great kings and noblemen that they came across. But by our period, this is going to change mainly because of the industrialism of European economies that made them stronger, far stronger than they used to be, in comparison relative to their to other countries like China, Japan, the African nations. And you also have these social Darwinistic views of superiority with as it relates to class and as it relates to race and ethnicity and culture. And so at this time, what's driving expansionism is not merely the capitalist system of raw materials and markets or the need for commodities and goods like before, but also the belief that as the dominant race and the dominant culture, it is the responsibility of those who are blessed to be this superior race to do what superior races are supposed to do, and that is lead the world. And this can be kind of broken down into two different ideas. So, on one hand, you have the kind of the power grab mentality that these nations of the world, like the Kingdom of the Congo and Ethiopia and South Africa and Mali and all these other places, India. Yeah, they might have some great things and they have some great spices and that, and they were probably great in their at their own time and back in the day. But we're the superior race. We have guns, we have ships, we have all of these, we have industrial capitalism. It is not only our duty to expand industrial capitalism, but it is our right. They would believe it is our right to go into these countries, go into these lands, and take what we need and take what we want. We are entitled to that. We are entitled to that because one, we know what to do with it, and two, they don't know what to do with it. And the second part of that is also we have the responsibility to lead. And the only way you can really lead is to go in and be more hands-on, to dictate and give people this civilization in the form of industrial capitalism, in the form of European-style education, imparting European culture, European customs, and of course, Christianity to go with it. So you have kind of like this twin pillar of social Darwinistic views of imperialism. One, it is our right and our duty to go out and subjugate the world and take what we need to survive and take what we need because we have a right to it. No one else is taking it. They don't know what to do with it. It's ours. We claim it. And you also have this kind of quasi-benevolent view, and I do stress quasi-benevolent, that Europeans have the duty and are sort of imparted with the responsibility to take care of people who are lesser than themselves. The poet and writer Rudyard Kipling called this the white man's burden. And we have sort of a political cartoon that shows us here with Uncle Sam being carried by a person of color. Behind him, we have a British prime minister, and behind him, we have a appears to be a German military leader following suit. Rudyard Kipling certainly had racial views that were not in step with ours today. But it's important to note that his white man's burden quote, which is attributed to the American occupation of the Philippines, which I'll mention a few times here and there, but I'm not going to get into too much. I'll mention it. How about next week? Because we'll talk about Japan and China, and the Philippines are not terribly far away from them. But to kind of put it mildly, the United States had a war with Spain where they acquired Cuba, Puerto Rico, Saint Domingue. They acquired the Philippines, the Marshall Islands, a lot of these territories, many of which we still have today. And after we, quote, promised to liberate the Filipinos from the Spanish, we decided to not liberate them at all, but instead make them part of our empire. And the Filipinos naturally didn't want to trade the Spanish for the Americans. And so they had a rebellion, and we ended up fighting them for a number of years in what's called the American-Filipino War. Well, Rudyard Kipling was making the comment, the white man's burden, rather sarcastically. And so Rudyard Kipling was not a proponent of the white man's burden, but he was making a critical observation of it. And you can see that here in this political cartoon. I should also note that you are reading an excerpt of The White Man's Burden this week as part of your reading, so just keep that in mind. Another political cartoon here that kind of shows us, this one's from an American perspective, and you can get a sense that a lot of these artists who are making these political cartoons are actually rather critical, or at least mildly critical, of what the United States is doing. So I should point out that these racial views and these views of imperialism and world domination are not ubiquitously supported. Not all Americans and not all British and not all French wanted to be doing this, and they made their voices heard rather clearly. But they were always, I don't know if they were the minority or not, but they were never in power enough to really do anything about it. And so take a look at this political cartoon and maybe pause the video for a moment. Just take a look at what you see here. Look at the racially stereotypical renderings you have here. Look at the names that are on each of the individuals on their books, and pay attention to what you see here. And just take a pause and just kind of run that through your mind for a moment and turn the video back on and we'll continue. Now that you've done that, you'll notice that in the back we have an American Indian who's trying to read, but you'll see that his book is clearly upside down. We have a very racially negative depicted person in the background washing windows. We have in the front row Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines. These were newly acquired territories by the United States throughout the 1880s and into the early 1900s. And then further back, you see people from these other places. We have California, we have Texas, we have these various states, and they look like they're clean and conservative and well kept and educated and morally superior to these people who are depicted down in front. So this again is that view that the white man has a duty to kind of not only go in and take these materials, promote themselves and promote their greatness, but spread civilization to people who clearly are in desperate need of it. At least that would be what their view is. The colonial governor, I don't know if he was called colonial governor, but he was the administrator of the Philippines, the American administrator of the Philippines, William Howard Taft, who would eventually go on to become president, coined a term that was later used by President William McKinley and then soon to be President Theodore Roosevelt. The United States had a duty, and then the United States is not the only one who believed this, but the United States had a duty for being this kind of powerful industrial civilization to look after and guide with a firm fist its little brown brothers, quote. And this would have been coined around 1901. So these would be, if I flip back here, if you look down in the front here, these would be the, quote, little brown brothers. Same with the American Indian. And we don't really talk about the American Indian in this course, but the American Indian had been subjected to this for a very long time, going all the way back to the founding of the colonies. So they were just part of this expanding empire that included people of color, non-whites, non-Western Europeans. So they are the little, quote, little brown brothers that the United States now has a duty to lead and guide and impart, quote, civilization to. So this is a great clip from a movie called The Ghost in the Darkness. I love The Ghost in the Darkness. It was a blockbuster when it came out, but it got some mixed reviews and critics didn't care for it for some good reasons and for some reasons that were just over the top. I absolutely love this movie, and the music and the music and the cinematography of the African landscape is quite amazing. And there's this great scene early on in the beginning of the movie featuring actor Val Kilmer, who's here in front of us, and Tom Wilkinson, who's in the scene, but he's not on the screen just yet, talking about the British Empire and its goals in Africa. And although we haven't gotten to Africa just yet, I want you to watch this clip and I want you to get a sense of what this idea of mission is. Mission, not necessarily in the religious sense, although that's part of it, but mission in the we need to lead the world, we need to save the world, we need to bring civilization to the world. You also get this sense of competition, this sort of laissez-faire competition between the great empires of the world as they divide up these, quote, lesser peoples and take these natural resources and make money and subjugate and deliver civilization to the world. Now, I want to point out that this clip used to exist on YouTube and then was removed. I don't know why. Maybe the person who had the video just got rid of it. So this movie is on Amazon Prime. And so what I did was I took it, turned on Amazon Prime, and ran the clip. Unfortunately, the video is very choppy because of that, although the audio is very good. So I do apologize for that. Please ignore it. But watch the video, listen to the conversation, listen to the dialogue, and you'll get a sense of this kind of this worldview, this kind of superior, the self-aggrandizing Western, let's just use a modern phrase for it, chauvinistic idea that it is up to us to guide the world to a greater place. So take a moment, pause this video, watch the clip, and come back to this video. Now that you've watched the clip, I hope you enjoyed it. The video, as I said, the movie, I should say, is on Amazon Prime. And actually, if you do watch it, I would love to hear back from anybody who watched it to know what they think of the movie, because it's a I think it's a very good movie. It could have been better in certain places, but overall, I think it's a much better movie than people give it credit for. And it's actually inspired by a true story, which is quite amazing. So what do we have here? What are we talking about? We have the British Empire competing against the Germans and the French. We have them laying ribbons of iron and steel, creating these vast railway networks connecting these different colonies that they have, Kenya, Uganda, places like that. And also, you'll notice that in addition to these things, the gentleman played by Tom Wilkinson, the gentleman with the mustache, Beaumont, I think is his name, John Beaumont, kind of a creepy figure. He notes that he is trying to end slavery, or the British Empire is trying to end slavery. And that's actually true. That is true. The slavery was extremely prevalent in Africa. It was still being conducted throughout the 1880s and into the early 1900s, mainly via the Islamic slave route, the Trans-Sahara slave route. And the British did moralize the issue. They moralized the issue in the early 1800s when they ended the transatlantic slave trade, and then eventually they abolished slavery in their own colonies. And then they used their navy, their very powerful navy, to try and blockade, bully, and manipulate ending the slave trade in places like Brazil, across South America. And they went and they raided slaving forts owned by the Portuguese along the African coast, right along here. So there is a good aspect to this, that the British were attempting to end slavery because they considered it morally reprehensible. But then at the same point, on the same token, in order to do that, they had to in order to do that, they went into places and they essentially became the overlords of these places, using their political and military might to do so. I want to take a moment and just draw a contemporary allusion here. And I know some of you are younger and you maybe don't remember all the conversations about it, but some of the students in this class are a little bit older, and they certainly will understand the allusion I'm going to make. And if you do understand it and you're one of the older students that get it, please maybe talk about it in the discussion board, maybe to kind of better explain it. But if you recall 9/11, after 9/11, the United States went into Afghanistan to take out the Taliban and bring Osama bin Laden to justice. But then eventually we went into Iraq to take out Saddam Hussein because he was considered a terrorist, a type of terror leader who was a danger to the United States, and also a man who spread fear and terror. And we call this the war on terror. And then there was this big speech about the axis of evil: North Korea, Iran, Iraq, the Taliban, and Afghanistan. So I kind of want to liken this. I don't do this very often, but I want to liken maybe the British going in to fight slavery, very similar to the United States going in to fight terrorism, or maybe in the 1950s and 60s, the United States going in to fight communism. The idea that there was maybe something a very good mission here, something worthy of attention: fighting slavery, fighting communism, fighting terrorism. But it ended up becoming for reasons good or bad, it became kind of polluted and mixed up in these ideas. At least in our case here, we're going back to the 19th and early 20th century now. These ideas of power and control and superiority, and to the point where the mission, even if it had a good purpose, somewhat became lost in this period of imperialism and colonialism. And here's a great political cartoon. I absolutely love this. That really encapsulates all this. We have this lady of civilization. She almost reminds us of Lady Liberty. The French really love using that image of this woman, this woman of civilization. And the United States does this as well with a famous political cartoon about manifest destiny, the idea that the United States would control both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans and everything in between, from California to New York. And they show a very similar looking woman with the light of civilization stretching her arm out across all of the savage lands and untamed lands of the Wild West. And here we have kind of the same idea here. We have this lady carrying the banner of civilization, and look who's behind her. We have a British soldier with a rifle and what looks like to be an American with an axe, and other clearly European people carrying their technologies, and they look strong and ready to fight. And look who they're against. They're against these savage barbarians who may be noble in their own way. They may be brave, and they might have a sense of honor and duty, but they are no match for Western civilization. It's our duty as industrial capitalists and Christians and white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and of course the French are Catholic, but all of these people grouped together to spread civilization to these lesser peoples of the world. At least that's what they would argue. I've been showing a lot of movie clips in this lecture, and I hope you guys like it. Actually, let me know how you feel about that, because I do love these things. I like to draw on all of this stuff to really pull you into this world. I'm trying to pull you into this world. This is a clip from a very good 1997 made-for-TV movie called The Rough Riders. And The Rough Riders is about Theodore Roosevelt, who's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigns when the battleship Maine is supposedly blown up by the Spanish in Havana, which kicks off the Spanish-American War at the end of in 1880. And the United States defeats Spain and eventually takes Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and all that stuff. The speech that the actor here, Tom Berenger, is giving as Theodore Roosevelt is actually word for word a speech that Theodore Roosevelt gave to the Navy War College. Although his speech was much longer, this is more condensed. But I love this speech because it really encapsulates a lot of things here. Just take a moment, pause the video, watch the speech, and then come back to this video, and we will conclude. Okay, now that you've watched that speech, that really, I mean, it almost reminds you of that Tuppence song from Mary Poppins. You have this idea that you're stretching your power out across the world. It is our duty. It is our right. It is our privilege. And he also talks about the greatness that industrialism has given the United States. He doesn't really put it in those terms, but he talks about a powerful modern Navy. And a powerful modern Navy is the only way to project force and structure and civilization around the world. And of course, a modern Navy enables you to go in and take raw materials and put down rebellions of indigenous people. He also talks about the fighting quality of the race, the great races of the world. Theodore Roosevelt, I love Theodore Roosevelt to death, but he was a man of his time, and he saw the world in very racial views, as everybody did. So there were the great Asian races, and you had the great black races, and you had the great white races, and the American race was built off of the European race, but it was its own race because we also had to fight Indians and Mexicans, and we took over this continent. So we were similar to the British, we were similar to the French, but we were American. We were very different. So we were a race entirely of ourselves. And so all the great races of the world were fighting races, he says, and it's our duty and our responsibility to be fighting races. And he also adds, as an extension of this, masculinity. That's another driver here of social Darwinism, and we got this last week. The people who were at the top were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but they weren't just white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. Margaret Sanger may have been kind of, in our view, part of the crowd, but at her time, she was also considered kind of a rebel because she was a woman, and she was a very outspoken woman at that. This was a man's world, and these men, and I do stress men, were going to show their mastery of their manliness and their courage and their racial qualities by engaging in warfare and taking resources and expanding empire, because that's what the great races of the world do. That's what men do. I mean, look at this picture here. Civilization may be a woman, a very delicate, beautiful, white, stress that, white woman, but notice that she's not spreading it alone. It's being spread by these men behind her who have the courage to go into these places and fight on behalf of her. Men defend civilization. Civilization may be a woman, but men defend and spread her. Theodore Roosevelt gives a speech in 1899 where he says, quote, "We do not admire the man of timid peace. We admire the man who embodies victorious effort." So we have this desire to, okay, I wanted to make sure that was the last slide. We have this desire, Europeans between the 1880s to 1914 have this desire to still obtain commodities, still spread Christianity, and they use that a lot to justify their imperialism. It's supposed to be a benevolent side of it. We're spreading Christianity. Christianity is part of civilization. We also have this need for it because of industrialism, industrial capitalism, to harness more raw materials and raw goods, to take those raw goods by force if necessary, to make them into manufactured commodities, which are then sold domestically and internationally back to the people whom we or they stole or took by force these raw materials. And then you have these social Darwinistic views that we are entitled to those raw materials and raw goods because we are superior. We know what to do with them. We know how to use them. We know how to maximize their worth and their value, whereas these other people don't. And then lastly, we have this sort of moral duty to do this because these people don't have spoons and they don't have English and they don't have Christianity and they don't have proper European clothing and things of that nature. And so we have come to save these people, even if it's from themselves. And yes, there might be some moral underpinnings here, like slavery, which is a real issue that they are legitimately trying to stop. But remember that at the end of the day, they stopped it merely by complete subjugation of these other peoples against their will. And we have to ask ourselves, was that a moral justification? And then you have people like Theodore Roosevelt who sort of adds that first part of social Darwinism, that not only do they have the right to take things and they have a right to go into places, but it's kind of part of what great races do. The timid man of peace is not somebody we admire. We don't celebrate priests and nuns and people who were soft and fed the poor and the hungry. I mean, actually, a lot of people did then and do today. But for people like Roosevelt and people like these captains of industry like Andrew Carnegie and the great monarchs of Europe, people like John Beaumont, who I believe may have been a fictional character in that scene from the Ghost in the Darkness. These people, for all of the good things they may have tried to stand for, at the end of the day, they saw themselves as people of a greater race, a fighting people with strong masculine undertones who were going to go in and they were going to take what they wanted and take what they needed because that's what they were entitled to do. So this is where this video ends, and we will move on to technology. And after technology, we will move on to some case studies. We will talk about India, then we will talk about Vietnam and what becomes what we call Southeast Asia. And then we will talk about Africa, and that will conclude our discussion for this week.